back to part 2 of chapter 34, Origin and Evolution of Vertebrates. And before I move on to the sharks, I wanted to come back to this particular nectostome slide because I forgot to talk about this particular fossil. I didn't write it on here because of the fact that I know you guys already have too many words to memorize. So but I would do want to mention how cool this tree creature is. This is actually remnants of the fossils. So it's the fossils of the earliest gnathostomes that are now extinct, but they were able to find that in the fossils. And this particular species, they have named it placoderms, which are covered with armor-like plates, which is why you see these things right here. These are, they say, armor-like plates, and they also have giant version of these placoderms that are measures up to 10 meters long, is what they say. So its jaw, according to its measurements and things like that, according to fossil record, and, mechanics, physics, all that stuff, biology put all together, they have calculated that this placoderm jaws can exert 8,000 pounds of force per square inch at the tip of its jaws. And that's pretty cool, which means it was probably a big predator back then. But because of all those mass extinctions we talked about that happened between those different eras and periods, they have become extinct. But it used to be probably a very powerful predators. All right, with that, then we are ready to talk about then the next group of species, which is conrythians. Conrythians are what we call cartilage fish, which means that their bones are not made up of calcium yet. They're still only mainly dominated by cartilage. And this particular group of conrythians includes your sharks, your rays, and then their relatives as well. And sharks are very interesting. So I love talking about this section of the chapter. It is for compared to all vertebrates in this chapter, Conrythians is the biggest and also most successful vertebrate predators in the ocean. And we'll talk about why they are the most successful predators as we talk about their traits. Their skeleton, like I said, are mostly made up of cartilage, which they're supposed to not have calcium within the cartilage, but in this particular special case, they do start to have some sort of calcium storage within those cartilage, but they're not exactly strong calcium bones that we have yet. But they are mainly still made up of cartilage, but they do see some traces of calcium in there. And they also saw some traces of bone tissue, what looks like bone tissue, that are found in scales of these species, the base of their teeth, and also a thin layer that surrounds their vertebrate surfaces. So now with Conrythians, let's start by talking about sharks. Sharks are scary creatures according to us humans, but in the from a biologist standpoint, they are really cool creatures. So sharks have a very streamlined body. If you look at its shape from this picture here, so that means they are very, very good swimmers. We're talking about going straight very fast. But because of specific things or structures that a shark has, they actually cannot maneuver very well, which means they cannot do sharp turns or go in circles very quickly. Okay. And so its trunk and tail fins. So here's the trunk and tail fins right there that allows for it to propel forward. Dorsal fin, the one at the top here, are what stabilizes the balance of the shark because it's just such a streamlined body shape. You imagine kind of like a kayak trying to maneuver in the water, so it can easily just swirl over or topple over. So the dorsal fin is what prevents that swirling and rolling over of the shark and make sure it stabilizes so that it's always in the correct orientation in the water. And then you have pectoral fins and pelvic fins that are then for maneuvering purposes. And I think probably because of the fact that they have, pretty small pectoral fins, they can't you really maneuver very well. the other thing why they can't maneuver very well is their buoyancy problem. So they do have some buoyancy assistance, and that's sort of accomplished by storing a humongous amount of oil. So if you ever dissect a shark and touch the inside of that dissected shark, you will see that your glove is completely drenched in that sticky oily substance. It's because of how much oil sharks have, and within its liver, there's a lot of oil as well. They store a lot of oil within its liver, which is why in one of the dissection videos, it talked about how if you take out the liver of the shark and put it in water, the liver would actually sink because it has, excuse me, not sink. It will actually float because of the amount of fat and oil that's within the liver itself. Um, so even though it has all that oil within its body and the liver, the density of the shark, the entire shark as a whole, is still heavier or more dense than water. So they have to continuously swim in order for it to stay afloat. If it stops swimming, the moment the shark stops swimming, it will actually sink down to the bottom of the ocean, which is why, again, contributes, I think, to why they cannot maneuver well. So so what they would do is as they're swimming, they can actually do gas exchange through these pharyngeal slits that we talked about. And under those, though, underneath those slits are your gills. So it is within those gills and water again moving through their mouth that will come out of their slits and passing through their gills that will allow for that carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange. It is the now when they do rest, because yes, you've been in aquariums. Some sharks are continuously swimming, but sometimes you may see a shark want to rest, and when they rest, of course, they have to rest on the seafloor because they will sink. But they still breathe. They still have to do gas exchange while they're resting at the bottom of the ocean. So it is when they're resting, it is their muscles of the jaw and pharynx that will pump water through the gills and allow for that gas exchange I talked about. So even though when they don't swim, they have sort of developed ways to breathe at the bottom of the ocean. Of course, most sharks are carnivores. And so they will either swallow their prey whole, usually if they can swallow the prey whole, if they're small enough. But when we're talking about much larger animals or species that they're trying to eat, they will use their teeth, and they have rows and rows of teeth, very sharp teeth that will be able to tear the flesh off the animal. And with their powerful jaws, they can clamp very tightly and yank pretty strongly too. So it is their muscles, their jaw strength, and their sharp teeth that makes them very good predators as well. I already said that sharks usually have several rows of teeth. You've seen those, sort of the shark jaw bone along with the teeth they have at museums, maybe. And you will see and those rows of teeth actually gradually move towards the front of the mouth, and they will grow that way. And then if old teeth were shed off, or they were broken from trying to tear things apart, because they say sharks will bite anything. Well, not bite anything they see, but if they think it's a prey, they will bite. They will try to, bite it. And so, if it's things that are not actual fish prey, but they bit on it and broke their teeth, they always have more teeth to come in just because of how strong their bite is. That's why they have all those teeth to make sure they don't run out of teeth. Um, Interestingly, even though they swallow everything whole, they actually have a shorter digestive tract than most other vertebrates. And the one way to slow down their digestion because of how short of an intestine they have is that they have something called spiral valve. So here's the intestine of the shark. It is very short. Like, I didn't see curls within the shark if you do a dissection of them. Because if you do other dissections of other mammals, pigs or minks, they will have curls of intestines within their abdominal cavity. But sharks only have that one big tube that I saw that was called an intestine. And if you were to cut that intestine open, then you will see these layers and layers of tissue that looks like a spiral. So it forms kind of like a spiral. So that's what they call it, a spiral valve, a big spiral that is stuck inside the intestine that allows for things or food matter to move in a corkscrew fashion instead of going, whoops, go straight down to the anus and without any sort of absorption. Because what's important, why food starts moving slowly when we get to the intestine is because we got to give it time to do all the absorption of nutrients and water that it needs to do. So in this case, the shark needs to feed and be able to absorb the nutrients from their prey. So that's this, very short tube of intestine is not very beneficial for them if the food is just moving right through it very quickly. So the purpose of the spiral valve is to slow down that digestive process because there's actually a spiral corkscrew, shape that the food matter have to go through, and also that spiral also gives extra surface area. So that extra surface area is very good for maximizing absorption, and then that corkscrew manner also slows down the digestive process again so that it can move very slowly through that small, short section of the digestive tract, but still maximize the amount of nutrients that the shark can absorb from their prey. All right, so then you have senses, okay? Senses of the sharks. They have very sharp vision, but sharks are colorblind. They can't tell the difference between red, green, or yellow. So they can only see grayscale probably if they're colorblind. And then there's nostrils in front of their head that is nothing to do with breathing because we already said aquatic animals breathe with their gills, not their nose, but they still have nostrils for the purpose of olfaction, which is why they can smell blood somewhere around and sense that there's a possible injured prey somewhere. That's why when they smell blood, they know they go right towards it because they know, okay, that's something that's bleeding, which means that's a prey that is struggling and I can easily chomp on it and ingest it. So that's why they have those nostrils for that purpose. And I already mentioned sharks have no eardrums, which means then if they were lifted out of the water, they cannot hear anything. No sound can go to their ears because there's no conduction of sound through air when you don't have eardrums. Eardrums works like a drum so that when sound waves are coming through your ear canals, their eardrum also vibrates at the same frequency as the sound. So because sharks don't have that, they are unable to hear any sounds by air, but they have other things that sort of counter the fact that they're colorblind and that they can't hear by air. Well, thankfully, they don't live in the air. So, I mean, not thankfully, but then in a sense that they don't, for the if I was a shark, I would be thankful I don't live in air. I live in water. So that's why I don't need that air conduction of sound. So they have something else. But before I get to that, let's get to the other cool trait that sharks have. So supposedly at the top of their head, they have a specific region within the skin that is called ampullae of Lorenzini. Okay, so ampullae of Lorenzini is what detects electric fields that is generated by any muscle contraction of nearby animals. I think on top of my head that they can sense this even 100 feet away. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, but I remember reading something like that. Not in the book, it's somewhere else. I was just interested in seeing how good their electroreception is. So, electroreception is sensing electrical fields and currents going through water. So, muscle contraction requires electricity. Okay, remember I said that before. That's why we need nervous tissue and muscle tissue in order to produce a movement. So whenever we move in any sort, especially if we move a lot, like running or wiggling our arms constantly, doing exercises, that's a lot of electricity in a sense, going from your brain to your muscles, telling it, keep contracting, keep contracting, keep contracting, and while you're doing all that movement. So that's what the shark, sort of senses. So the more movement you make in the water, the more electricity is going in your arm muscles or leg muscles, the more the shark is able to sense it. because of the fact that they can sense electric fields generated that is around them in the environment. So again, if you're thinking about a struggling prey, let's say you're a fish that were injured and you're struggling to stay alive, those fishes usually wiggle a lot. So while they're wiggling, struggling to survive, that's a signal to the shark. Oh, there's a injured prey somewhere. I'm gonna go head straight for it really quickly and swallow it whole. And that electroreception is kind of making up for the fact that they're colorblind and also the fact that they can't hear. But even though they can't hear by ear, remember they're in water. So sharks' entire body can actually transmit sounds using vibrations in the water. So those vibration goes through their skin, and we already talked about the fact that fish have lateral line system. So in this case, it's the lateral line system of the sharks that is able to sense those vibrations. Let's say if someone is, making sounds in the water, sound wave still is generated in water. It might be a little different compared to air because it's a more viscous medium compared to air, but there are still sound waves in the water itself. It's kind of like how when we go in water, we everything just sounds muffled and weird. Okay, maybe it's like that for the sharks, but at least they're still able to sense some vibration coming through, and also why they tend to hear lower frequency sounds better because lower frequency sounds have more vibration. Okay, and they're able to hear it. And the louder it is, the more they're able to sense it, of course, because the vibrations are coming more quick frequently towards their sensory organs on the lateral line system. So once they hear that, they sense that on their lateral line system, it will send an action potential of electricity to their inner ear to tell them, hey, you're hearing something. And they will sort of swim towards it to see, what's going on? What is this sound coming from? Um, so again, they tend to respond to deeper sounds with lower frequencies. Now, in terms of reproduction, the shark's body on the male, right on the pelvic fins, have an extra extension off of it. So if you look at the shark body here, the pectoral fins, I'm just doing some very quick drawings. Don't mind me drawing these weird cute little ear looking thing. But that's it. That's the pectoral fin. That is the pelvic fin. On the bottom of the pelvic fin have these long structures that goes down the tail of their body. Those are called claspers. And claspers, I forgot to bold underline that. So make sure you bold underline claspers. That's a word you got to know. And claspers is what then allow for transfer of the sperm into the female's reproductive tract to fertilize the eggs. Now, there's a couple ways that those eggs will develop when they're born, etc. So and depending on how and when they're born, they're called different things. So some species of sharks are what we call oviparous. Okay, oviparous is because is when they lay eggs that hatch outside of the mother's body, which means the mother shark actually lay eggs itself and not the little baby shark that comes out of the mother. Okay, so the egg comes out, the mom kind of puts the egg somewhere safe, and then the small little baby shark would then hatch out of the eggs outside of the mother's body. Now, some shark species are ovoviviparous. Okay, um, ovoviviparous excuse me, oviviparous. Okay, ovoviviparous means that the fertilized eggs will stay within the oviduct, which are the where fertilized eggs or embryos goes through in order to get to the uterus. So for humans anyway, there are uterus shapes like this. So these connects to the ovaries on either side. These are the ovaries, and then on top of that, I don't want to go away. Okay. And then so this area, these and this is then the oviducts, which allows the embryo to well, first of all, the egg to be released from the ovaries, and the egg travel into the oviduct and some gets fertilized within there, and then it will slowly move towards the uterus and embed into the uterine wall in order for that embryo to be developed. So That's what we mean by oviduct. And then this is, in case of a shark. So there's actually egg yolk that's inside the egg that will nourish the eggs. And then the offspring will hatch within the uterus before being born. So, so that's ovoviviparous, okay? Ovoviviparous in that case, okay? And then you have some shark species. It's a mouthful, I know. And there are some shark species that are viviparous, okay? Viviparous, which are then offspring that can develop within the uterus, obtain nutrients from the mother's blood through a yolk sac plus placenta. Now that sounds pretty normal. There will be more bizarre way. Second way is that they can absorb nutrient-rich fluid that is produced by the uterus. Third way, which is a bizarre way, they can also eat other eggs within the uterus. Now, that's pretty scary. I guess, survival of the fittest. I mean, going with that, right? Natural selection. Remember, we talked about the criteria for natural selection is that animals will generate more offspring than they need to. Well, there's generating more offspring. Whatever is strongest will then eat the others in that sense. So these are, shark species that are viviparous will then have this feature, these three options, depending on what specific species we're talking about. Oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. I want to get this down. So, okay. All right. And then reproductive tract is then will what empties the, either the, the offspring or the egg or the actual little baby shark itself is what empties along with excretory system, and they don't have two openings for their offspring versus their waste stuff, like humans do. Sharks, everything comes out of the same opening called the cloaca. Okay, so the cloaca is actually a common chamber that contains stuff from the reproductive tract, from the excretory system, and the digestive tract all goes on there in the single common chamber, and then they will open to a single opening to the outside. So whatever is coming out, it will come out of those three, three different systems in a sense in the cloaca, out of the cloaca. Okay, but we said, conrichthians is actually sharks and rays, but most of this section mention and discuss about sharks because rays are actually pretty similar to sharks. They're related to sharks too, but they just have some different lifestyle and slightly different shapes of the body if you compare a stingray to a shark. So first of all, stingrays or rays in general are bottom feeders, which is why they will swim around the bottom, just like this picture is showing right there, looking for any mollusk or crustaceans that is crawling along the ocean floor, and they will actually ingest that whole thing whole, and they will crush their jaws are so powerful, just like the shark, that they can crush mollusk shells and also the exoskeletons of the crustaceans as well with their jaws. That's pretty strong jaws. And then they have a flattened body shape versus a streamlined shape compared to sharks. And then they have enlarged pectoral fins, which is these fins right here, very, very much enlarged compared to the sharks. And that's what they do for movement, which is they kind of, sort of flap in a, wing-like matter, kind of like how birds can swim. They would be, flapping their wings in the water, and that's really, in a sense, an analogy to how stingrays can swim through the water. And then they also have what looks like a whip-like tail that for some species it can have venomous barbs at the end of the tail for self-defense purposes. And I think I remember reading that's how a famous, I forgot his name on top of my head right now, but he's an Australian zookeeper, owns a zoo, and he died from this barb that stuck straight into his heart, I think is the area that he got stung in, and he died pretty soon after that. So don't mess with the wild, don't mess with the rays because they have those venomous barbs at the end of the tails that it kind of just stabs into whoever is chasing them, just like a knife or a sword will, which is pretty scary. All right, so I wanted to show you this particular video because It kind of shows you that cool electroreception I talked about, which is why I want to show you this particular video. So let me show this one to you.
Elasmobranch research labs in Florida, scientists have devised an experiment to see what sense the hammerhead is using when taste, smell, touch, sight, and hearing just aren't enough. Might they be able to detect that electric
It's
field?
super cool. You need to watch this.
By placing electrodes under the floor of the tank, they can replicate the electricity generated by a prey item. In theory, the sharks should be able to detect that minute pulse.
It will get the sharks to come in and bite at the electrodes, just as if it were a fish or a crab or something buried under the sand.
It will be the hammerhead's sense of smell that will first trigger the urge to hunt.
Squid juice.
Squid juice.
Squid juice coming out. Oh, look at that. So fast.
We're just using odor just to trigger them.
We use different senses from different distances. So you can imagine a shark might get a smell of a wounded prey struggling just under the sand from perhaps tens of meters away.
The shark goes into classic hunting mode, swimming in ever tighter
That's the
figures of
ampulla of
eight to try and
Lorenzini.
detect the source of the smell. But at the last minute, Steve throws the switch.
The electrode is on. Right.
Coming in.
Boom.
Strike. Gotcha.
Good bite. Good bite at two. Good
Look
bite
at
at two.
that.
And
All right.
off. Okay, see, coming in fast. The electrode is on. Spinning around. Look, bite,
Right
bite.
away.
Look, clear. Clear biting.
Wow.
Beautiful. All right, switch that off. Other electrode on. Got it. Got it. Look at that. Look at that. Spinning right around.
Nice.
Multiple repeated bites. That is very clear.
Hey, that looks good.
Score.
Woo!
Well done.
All right.
So that is a perfect demonstration of how sensitive the sharks are to strong electric fields like that. And they said it was pulses of electric fields. And were being, turned on, and you saw how quickly the shark just went straight towards it. So this is why they say, and I'm not giving any suggestions here, but I'm just saying, going off of what I read online and in videos as well. If you see a shark, you have to stay calm. And if, let's say you encounter a shark on the beach, you have to stay calm, because the more you move, the more electric field you are generating, and the more the shark will say, okay, that's a struggling prey. I'm gonna go eat you. Okay, so gotta stay. I know it's hard to do. I just hope I never get to encounter a shark ever in the wild. Just in aquariums, it's fine, but never in the wild. Okay. Now,
Elasmobranch
even though we talked about how, Corinthians are so strong and they have thrived actually for more than 400 million years, going back in the history of how these animals have evolved, they are actually threatened dramatically by overfishing. Of course, human impact in that sense. And they say that the shark population in the Pacific, for example, have dropped by up to 95%. So even though they are scary predators, but we don't want to lose them either. Okay, just think about how many of the species they're eating, the animal populations they're eating in the ocean. If we lose the shark, what will happen to those animal population? It messes up the ecological, the ecosystem in a sense, or the what we call the ecological niche or ecological balance. The way food web works is that we have this perfectly balanced ecology by having different animals prey on different population of species, so that because this particular species prey on that population, it keeps that population size in check. When you take away the predator, then whatever it used to prey on, they will become overpopulated, and who knows if they will start messing up the entire ecosystem in that particular area, harming other species, so on and so forth. It will just keep snowballing, which is why we want to keep our biodiversity even in animals, and stop them from going extinct in the case of sharks.
Elasmo
Anyway, all right, and then you have the next group of vertebrates called os- osteichthyes. Okay, osteichthyes. So osteichthyes is a representation of pretty much the bony fishes. So why it's called osteichthyes is in anatomy, we said the prefix oste always means something to do with bones. So the fact that it starts with oste tells you already that it means bony something, okay? Something to do with bones. In this case, bony fishes versus cartilage fish with the sharks. So these osteichthyes have ossified bony endoskeleton. Finally, we have vertebrate bones that are completely ossified with calcium. In this case, a very hard matrix of calcium phosphate specifically, just like humans do. We have calcium phosphate as a major ingredient as well, and then mixes it in with the other cost calcium molecules as well. But this is the first appearance of an ossified bony endoskeleton appearing in bony fishes. So for fishes, we already know they are aquatic. But there are osteichthyans that are not aquatic. How fishes breathe is that they draw about 4 to 5. They draw water through about 4 to 5 pairs of gills. So here's their gills right there. Water goes in through their mouth, and the water will flow in through these gills. And there's 4 to 5 pairs of them for a good purpose of having a lot of surface area, again for gas exchange, and then whatever they breathe out will come out of the gills through this little flap. Usually when you look at fishes, they have this little flap around right here covering up their gills. That's have a name, and it is called operculum. Okay, so the operculum is what covers up over the gill, so that when the operculum is opening and shutting, that is what allows water to move through the mouth, out the gills, move through the mouth, out the gills. That way water is continuously moving through the gills without going into the digestive tract again, and is only doing gas exchange for the fish. For fishes, contrary to sharks, they are able to maintain their buoyancy regardless the depth of the water body they're in. Whether they're really, really deep into the deep ocean or on the surface, they're able to keep their buoyancy and not go out of whack or swim everywhere or flip upside down because they have something called the swim bladder. So the swim bladder is kind of like an air sac. So here is the swim bladder right there in the fish, and it actually is able to shuttle gas between the blood and the bladder to keep the volume of gas within the bladder always constant. Okay, it's kind of like the submarine if you think of it in that sense. Is that you trying to sink, so you would have more less air in the swim bladder, and if you want to float, there should be more air going in the swim bladder, etc. So that in a sense that you always have some sort of equilibrium of air and water between the fish and the surrounding space. So that's why fish, they don't have to constantly swim like sharks do in order to stay afloat, because of the fact that they have that swim bladder. Which is also why if you have pet fishes or pet goldfishes and you see a fish upside down in your tank, they always say, usually the first thing people say is like, oh, that's their swim bladder. Something's wrong with their swim bladder. Or that's because when you don't have a functional swim bladder, the fish will end up swimming upside down because they can't control their movements without the swim bladder. Their buoyancy is messed up within the water. All right, and then for skin of these fishes, they're covered by flattened bony scales. So this is again something different from the sharks. The surface of the shark, if you remember the dissection video, when you put your gloved hand over the shark skin, there is that sound, okay? And versus when it's smooth, there's no sound. And that's just that sound is because of the fact that the surface of the shark has tooth-like structures too. This is what's rubbing against the glove to give you that rushy sound. So in the case of fishes or osteichthyes is that they don't have those tooth-like scales. They have bony scales that are flattened, which is why when we draw fishes, a lot of times we kind of do that's the operculum, and then we do this, right? So all of that is then the flattened bony scales that we're talking about here. Now, on top of the skin of these fishes, there's also glands that will secrete a slimy mucus over their skin, again, for the purpose of reducing drag when they're swimming. If they're smooth, they're really streamlined in the water, they will be able to swim very quickly. Which is why when you try to pick up a fish, sometimes it slips out of your hand is because of that slimy coat of mucus it has all over its body with the glands that's releasing it on its skin. Now, a row of tiny pits is also present on the skin, um, in what kind of like aligns into what's called the lateral line system. This is where lateral line system is formed on the body of the fish. Are these tiny little pits that form a lateral line across the side of the fishes, the sides of the fish. And again, remember that they are for the purpose of feeling differences in water vibrations. In terms of reproduction, most fish species are actually oviparous, which means that they have, the females lay eggs, and in this case, unfertilized eggs, and usually that those of eggs will be released into the water, stay in a clump in a particular area. Then the male comes by the clump of eggs, and they will release their sperm. The sperm will then, fertilize the eggs. So just like this picture right here, you have the female laying her eggs in a particular area. Then a male comes by, when then will release his sperm, and the sperm will then fertilize those eggs. So, which is why fishes do external fertilization. All right, the next, so here is a specific group of osteichthyes, which is the fishes. And then, so in this particular one, these are called ray fin fishes, okay, or actinopterygii. And bony rays is what supports their fins, okay. So in this case, we have these structures of bony rays that I talked about, and these particular fishes, ray fin fishes, are what serves as a major source of protein for humans. So there's a big fishery industry with these particular fishes is what we ingest as food a lot. So your typical salmon, tuna, etc. Those are our major proteins, fishes, because they are large with a lot of meat on them. And then, so here are the 4 species of these ray fin fishes. You have yellow tuna right here, which are very fast swimming, schooling fish. What the schooling fish means, it means that these are fish that like to swim with other fishes of their species. They don't like to be on their own. That's what schooling fish is. They kind of swim in schools of multiple fishes. And they are commercially, of course, important worldwide for sashimis, tuna, those, the cutlets, things like that, things that, human ingest as your fish meal. And then you have lionfish, which you don't want to eat that one. They can actually, their spines, you see all these spines coming out of their body. They can inject venom into you, and that can, either cause harm or you will die. So they are native to Pacific Ocean coral reefs. Going back to why coral reefs are important, they are part of the ecosystem, even though they're venomous. And then there is the seahorse right here, still part of the ray fish species. They're a highly modified body form, though, of course, because when you look at a seahorse, they look nothing like a fish, but they are under the same category or group as ray fin fishes. And the males, and that's something different with nature, is that for seahorses, it is the males that carries their offspring during their embryonic development. So the big, pregnant bump is on the males for seahorses, which is something very bizarre compared to what usually happens in the wild. Is the females that usually carry the babies. Last but not least, you have moral eels, which are usually predators that ambushes their prey from crevices within the coral reef habitat. Again, these are ray fin fishes that live in coral habitats when we're talking about these moray eels. Second category of Osseictians is lobe fishes. So for lobe fishes, these are usually have rod-shaped bones that are surrounded by a thick layer of muscles that are within your either your pectoral fins or your pelvic fins for these fishes. There are three lineages of these lobe fin fishes. You either have coelacanths, okay, coelacanths, remember that's kind of like a coelom, but it's coelacanths. So coelacanths, they live off the coast of southern Africa and Indonesia. They're found living off of there. They actually thought this particular species was not, kind of extinct. They didn't think it was alive anymore. But until they were actually able to find these off of that particular area in Africa, that's they really realized, oh, these are actually still living. So they thought they were extinct, but it's actually still living. And this is how they look like in the ocean. Okay, so the fancy name for them is Actinicia. Second group of lobe-fin fishes are lungfishes. And the fact that they're called lungfishes tells you something. These fishes actually have the capacity to surface a little bit out of water, and they're able to gulp air into their lungs. So these fishes have lungs in them, which is why they're called lungfishes. And this lung connect to their pharynx, back of their throat, and then go through that gas exchange process and deliver oxygen to their body. And because of this feature of them being able to breathe with quote unquote lungs, they're able to burrow into mud and wait when, let's say, there's a big dehydration happening. It's too hot this year. It took off a lot of the water from the ponds. And so those dry seasons where ponds can shrink, lungfishes can actually hide within the mud. They kind of bury themselves in there and they're able to stay there until there's moisture again because of the fact that they can use their lungs to gulp air from oxygen from the air. Third group of lobefin fishes, which then is what we know as tetrapods. Tetrapods are the far more diverse group. It's not summarized in two sentences, which is why when the last part of the chapter focuses on tetrapods. They're really adapted to life on land. So we'll talk about all the traits they have for bringing life on land, because so far we've been talking about marine animals. And it is them, tetrapods, that gave rise to vertebrates that have limbs and feet because we didn't need those in the water. What you need in the water are ray fins, okay, that have bony rays on them, and you want a lot of fins to help you maneuver through the water. But if you try to put a fish on land, they're gonna just lay down on their side and can't even maybe jump and wiggle a little bit, but they cannot ever walk. So in order for adaptations on land, vertebrate animals will have to have limbs instead of fins. Okay, hands and arms and feet, arm and legs, hands and feet. All right, so we are at then this last group of species we'll talk about, which are tetrapods. Okay, even those last group, we still have some ways to go. Tetrapods is a very diverse group of animal species. So tetrapods means that these are animals with 4 feet, okay, or 4 limbs. They have these limbs that are able to support their weight on land. So you imagine if we don't have our legs, we would just be a wobbly thing on the floor, cannot stand up. So you have to have legs that are able to allow you to stabilize or balance your weight over those limbs and be able to walk on land without the buoyancy of water to help you. And then there's feet with digits. Again, digits are the toes in this case because this is the feet digits. And this is what allows for walking is because they say the feet's toes actually, disperse the force you're putting on it against the ground, distribute it amongst your body and allow for a very stabilized movement on land. So life on land selected for other changes in the body plan other than the limbs that we talked about. So in the head, now your head is separated from the body by a neck area right there. And within the neck area, there are now 2 vertebrae that will allow the skull to move in a particular motion. So for humans, we have 2 first vertebrae is right here, sort of abbreviated as C1 or C2 because they are cervical vertebrae. There's three different sections of vertebrae down our spine. The top area in the neck is then the um, oh, I just said cervical vertebrae, and then something it just flew out of my brain. And then we actually have specific names for those first two vertebrae, which is atlas and axis. And we said that these two bones are like gives us a joint, forms a joint that allows us to rotate our head. So which is why it's because of the development of a neck with these two vertebrae, they're able to move in a specific manner. Our head is able to move up and down, also now swinging side to side with the addition of these two vertebrae. Now, bones of the pelvic girdle, which is the hip, is then fused to the backbone. Now it's fused instead of being separated. And that is what permits the forces generated by your hind legs to be transferred to the rest of your body. Again, not wasting that energy that your thigh muscles are putting in and allow you to walk properly and efficiently. And then instead of instead of gills, okay, now your pharyngeal cleft develop into ears, tonsils, and thymus for tetrapods because we don't need gills. We're not living in water. So everything that we had for fish is now been modified to live on land with tetrapods. Now, how did tetrapods first evolve is what scientists were thinking. How did animals with fins and lobe fins all of a sudden swimming happily in the water all of a sudden decide to let's try to colonize land. And for a while they have not been able to find what we call the transition species from marine animal that swims versus a walking climbing animal that lives on land. It wasn't until 2004 that scientists found a fossil and they named it Tiktaalik, which was again discovered very recently. 2004 is not that long ago. And this is the creature that gave clues on how process of modification happens between fish and tetrapods, which gives them that adaptation on land. So when they found this particular fossil, the two scientists that was digging and looking for fossils, they saw this flat head first, and eventually they found, being able to deduce other structures from it. So they say that this particular creature that formed this fossil, in a way, was like a fish because they have fins, they are gills, there's lungs, and there's also scales. Of course, scales and fins, that's definitely traits that only fish should have. No land animal should have those particular features because they're not living in water. Um, but at the same time, this particular fish-like creature has things that is not a fish. So on top of having fins, gills, and scales, it also had a full set of ribs, which they deduce is what helps the creature breathe air and support its entire body. Okay, that's what our rib is for, is to protect the delicate tissues underneath. And our ribs are allow this humongous rib cage that allows the lungs to expand and contract when we're breathing properly in the air. So that is something that is different in this particular creature. And they also saw what looks like a neck, which allows that fish or that creature to move its head. And bones at the front fin now have some bone arrangement. It's starting to look like remember that comparative anatomy we looked at on the forearm. So they say that when they looked at the limb of this particular Tiktaalik creature, they were able to see that they have the same bone arrangements. They have a humerus followed by radius and ulna, and then you also have what the wrist bones or what's called the carpal bones in anatomy. So the fact that you have wrist radius, ulnar, and the humerus is something already very different compared to fishes because fishes have none of that. And then lastly, there is a pelvis now that is around where the rear fin is. And these particular features are now larger than a fish. So normal fish still have pelvis and a rear fin, But on this Tiktaalik, they see that is a lot bigger than what you normal fishes would have. And they say it's bigger is because of the fact that it, maybe it allowed the fish to properly kind of prop itself up and walk in water while on its fins. I mean, it's very unlikely that this fish actually just walked like human beings do. But think of how a seal walks. They think that that's probably what Tiktaalik can do with its fins, maybe not as strong as seals, so that's why they still need some water at the bottom to keep its buoyancy and help with the movements, but definitely not completely on land, which speaks for itself that this may be the in between species between humans and animals on land versus animals in the water. So then with that, we're ready to talk about the last, groups of on this chordates phylogeny, starting with the talking about the tetrapods. So tetrapods, the first group we'll talk about is the amphibia. Amphibia includes three groups of animals. You have salamanders, frogs, and caecilians. Probably the one you're probably not familiar with is caecilians. We'll get to that when we get to that particular group. So for frogs, they have very interesting life stages. That's why we call them amphibians. Amphibias, remember, does not mean that this particular animal lives a dual life where sometimes it lives in the water, sometimes it likes to live on land, and then all of it feels like it will go back in the water to live. When we're talking about frogs, there's aquatic frogs versus terrestrial frogs. And of course, aquatic frogs stay in the water, terrestrial frogs stay on land. So those supposed to never have a dual life. What amphibia means or amphibia means is that they have two life stages that can be where one lives in one medium and then another life cycle stage lives in another medium. And in this particular frog's case, that is true because larval stage of frogs are called tadpoles and they are actually herbivores and they with gills on them and also a fin tail. So it looks like this right here. And, that looks nothing like the final animal that we see with the frogs. So because of the fact that for frog larvas or tadpoles, they have to have the capacity to swim. If they don't have the capacity to swim, they will not make it, which is why that's why they're called amphibians, is because part of their life stages have to be in water, part of it have to be out in the air on land. So during my metamorphosis, a lot of things happen for the tadpole. At first, it will develop legs, develop lungs for inhaling air from the air, for air from the air, oxygen from the air, and then a pair of external eardrums is also formed, and then a digestive system for the carnivorous diet that these amphibia might be on because they ingest insects. Insects are still carnivorous diet. And then gills and the lateral line system will also disappear because they don't need it anymore. They're not going back to the water to live, so they lose their gills and lateral line system. So this is how the tadpole will look like during that metamorphosis, seeing the limbs being formed on the particular tadpole, and also this tail is also starting to degenerate. For amphibians, they rely mostly on their moist skin for gas exchange. Now, this is something different with the other species we've been talking about that uses gills. No, they don't use gills for frogs, but then they use their skin. So they don't really have a very big lungs for gas exchange. They do have lungs, like we saw in the dissection video, but they're kind of small, is not very large, and so mainly their gas exchange happens between the air and the skin. So let's say if the skin was to dry out, they will be in a low oxygen crisis. So that's why they have mucus glands and is continuously secreting mucus on the back of the frogs, just like fish do, because they cannot afford to dry out. They will die. And then for reproduction of amphibia, they are also external fertilization for where some species they will lay a few eggs, and then either the male or the female will actually house the eggs inside their back, which is kind of, I don't know, it gives me goosebumps when I watch those videos of frogs, letting go of their embryos from their back. I cannot watch it. Um, but sometimes it's not just the back, okay? Some species will house their young in their mouth, so you see them kind of look like vomiting, or all these little frogs are jumping out of their mouth, and sometimes even their stomach, okay, come all the way out from their stomach. Oof. So males, in terms of reproduction, may actually vocalize to defend their breeding territory or to attract males, which is why we hear this croak, 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 croak sound when we think about frogs. It's all for courtship purposes and defending their breeding area. And then you have three groups of amphibia, first of those being salamanders, and we kind of talked about this in the previous chapters too. They're known as Urodela, which then, Urodela means that they are what's called a tailed one. So this is an animal that is tailed, as you can see in this picture. Most of them will live on land, and they will walk on land, kind of in this side-to-side pattern, because of the fact that their body is kind of shaped that way. They kind of bend their body to walk to walk forward. And second group of tetrapods, amphibia, is then your frogs, which we've been talking about. They are called scientifically anura, which means tailless. Remember, means without, so in this case, I guess neura means tails. So anura means no tails. And frogs as adult species don't have tails, they lose their tails, and then they use mainly their hind legs to hop on land terrain. And I already talked about how there's supposed to be skin glands that secrete this mucus on top of their body for gas exchange purposes. For some frogs, they actually can secrete some distasteful and poisonous mucus as well to avoid them getting eaten, because some animals will just wipe that frog up and eat them and swallow them whole. But if you look like you're a dangerous frog, they're not going to eat you. So, many poisonous species usually have bright coloration. So, if you see a frog that has bright green, bright yellow, bright orange, or bright red on their body, not very camouflage, then that probably is a poisonous frog. So, just be careful. Somehow, predators just assume that when they see bright colored things, that means danger, which is interesting. Um, the third group of amphibia is the one I said you may not be familiar with. It's called Sicilians or apoda. Again, A for none. Pods means leg. So that's what they are, legless. So this is their legless lizard or the snake looking thing. But they are part of the amphibia. They are nearly blind and they actually resemble earthworms when you look at them. When you look at that picture. And most of them will burrow moist forest soil. So this is why, again, you will see them in soil area. All right, for that is all for amphibia. Now moving on to amniotes. Amniotes is a group of tetrapods that include your reptiles, birds, and mammals. So for traits shared by amniotes is the fact that they have an amniotic egg. So what's an amniotic egg is that it is an embryo that contains 4 extra embryonic membranes. Notice the emphasis on extra embryonic there, which means that this is not tissues that will give rise to any part of the embryo. It is literally just extra layers that surround the embryo, but not part of the embryo. And they will develop from tissue layers that grow out from the embryo, usually. But they will not become a part of the embryo at the end or last part of embryo development. And then they will allow embryos to develop on land by having these 4 membranes. So what is so cool about this 4 extra embryonic membrane? So first of all, you have the amnion. Excuse me. They have the amnion right here that surrounds the embryo. That's why it's called an amniotic egg. Amnion pretty much is a sac or cavity that, filled with a bag over it, is what protects the embryo in a fluid-filled cavity that cushions against mechanical shock. So this is why a lot of species means, when they're just embryos can't fend them for themselves, they're housed within their maternal side inside their mom's body and then surrounded by water so that if you hit a bump or you fall, technically speaking, you have all that water to act as that mechanical shock. And you have the chorion. Chorion is right here, this pink area. Chorion will eventually make the sort of transfer of air and gases between the embryo and the environment surrounding you, or in a sense, your mom's blood, because it is the mother that is breathing actual air, and the mother is just passing those air onto her embryo via the connection. In humans, that is your umbilical cord. And then you have the yolk sac. Believe it or not, humans also have a yolk sac. The yolk sac contains nutrients. That's why it's called a yolk sac. And other embryos are also in there to make sure it feeds the embryo correctly. And then you have the allantois. The allantois right there. So the allantois is a disposable sac for metabolic wastes, which means if there's poop, there's pee, they usually go straight into that particular pouch so that it doesn't get reabsorbed back into the embryo's body, which then becomes toxic and then it can end the baby's life. All right, so second trait that is shared by all amniotes is then an amniotic egg shell. Okay, so shell was not developed before this. Well, they were not sort of developed before amniotes because, if you're talking about frog eggs, they're actually soft eggs. So they are surrounded by this soft gelatinous, surrounding. So that if you try to put those eggs, frog eggs, on land, those frog eggs will actually just dry out instead of turning into your adult maturity. So that's why they cannot survive on land when we're talking about those particular eggs. So the shell is what prevents the egg and whatever is inside from dehydration. It can't probably prevent it 100%, but for sure it will slow it down. Third group is then your rib cage. The third thing that is shared by all amniotes is that they all have rib cage that ventilate lungs. Ventilation means moving air in and out of your body, of your lungs in this case. So in and out of your lungs. So and if you're able to move air in and out of your lungs, that's when you have an efficient gas exchange, dumping off oxygen to your cells and picking up carbon dioxide and let it, go out into the world. So usually for amniotes, they develop less permeable skin on the shell compared with amphibians because, they're conserving water in that sense. So when you're talking about amniotes, their um, skin is now more impenetrable, okay, or impermeable, so water won't start leaking out of your skin. Now imagine if you lose a lot of water on your skin by being constantly wet on top of your skin surface. Not only does that not sound comfortable, but it also loses a lot of water for you, which is why when we sweat, we need to replenish with a lot of fresh water to make sure we have enough water in the body. So good thing that we don't have, permeable, very, very permeable skin or slimy skins nowadays because of the fact, or mucousy skin, by the way, so that we can conserve all that water we drink and not just lose them. All right, it is 1 hour, 3 minutes. I will pause here and then continue in part three, but we're almost there. Part three will not be 1 hour long. I promise that.